Hello there. Now that we've moved into null hypothesis significance testing, it's time that we begin our discussion on error. So when we're dealing with null hypothesis significance testing, we have two types of error that are common. We have type 1 errors, and we have type 2 errors. A type 1 error, and let's put that in a different color. Type 1 error is where we reject the null when the null is true. Conversely, a type 2 error, let's stay consistent in our coloring here, is where we accept the null when the null is false. If we were to put this in a table like so many statistics textbooks do, we'd end up with something like this. So we make our decision, and we only have two decisions. We can accept the null, or we can reject null. Let's go ahead and use red to bound these. Then we have two scenarios. The first scenario is that null is true, and the other scenario is null is false. So when we accept the null and the null is true, we have made a correct decision. When we accept the null and the null is false, we have made a type 2 error. When we reject the null and the null is true, we have made a type 1 error. And when we reject the null and the null is false, we have made our correct decision. Now, there are formulas for calculating each of these. We'll go ahead and put this in red. For our correct decision up here, the probability, let's go ahead and just pull this up top here. The probability of this is equal to 1 minus alpha, which is essentially saying that 1 minus whatever our significance level is, our p-value, so typically 0.05 is the probability of getting this correct decision. We set this because we set our alpha level, and so that means that normally we're saying that 95% of the time we will get a correct decision. We will accept the null when the null is true. If we set an alpha level of 0.1, that changes it from 95% to 90%. If we were to change the alpha level to 0.01, we'd end up with 99% instead of 95%. Now, let's look at type 1 error down here. Our type 1 error, the probability of the type 1 error is equal to alpha. Now, you may have noticed that this column sums to 1, and that will be true for our other column as well. We know that whatever occurs here sums to 1. The same will occur over here, but we'll put that in a moment. For our type 2 error, the probability is equal to beta. And we'll get into what that means in a moment. For our correct decision, we have our probability is equal to 1 minus beta. Now, another way of saying this is power. So 1 minus beta equals power. So if we have a power of 0.8, a very highly powered study, maybe with a strong manipulation, that means that beta is equal to 0.2, which means about a 20% chance of a type 2 error, an 80% chance of a correct decision. And again, you'll see that these sum to 1. Now, this takes care of our type 1 and 2 errors. There is something else that I'm going to bring in here. When I mentioned at the end of the last video about type 3 errors, what I was referring to is the idea that we can get significance in the wrong direction. Now, this does not come up too often because most of the time you will be using a two-tailed test instead of a one-tailed test. And so this is something that you should just be familiar with just in case you come across it or your professor asks about it, as opposed to something that is truly essential to your understanding of null hypothesis significance testing, like our type 1 and 2 errors up here. So most of your attention on this, a little bit on this just as sort of a trivia fact. And you know, it's not used so much, and I'm not even aware if there is a way that you calculate a type 3 error rate. I'm just familiar with that it exists, and I think that that level of familiarity in my understanding really goes to show that this type 3 error rate and the single-tailed test that is the only thing that can cause it, or where is the only scenario where it can show up, really is very rare. And so we don't pay a whole lot of attention to it. But if you are aware of a way to calculate this, I'd be interested in knowing, and you can let me know down in the comments below. So there you go. Our types of errors in null hypothesis significance testing. I hope this is helpful for you. Let me know if there's anything you'd like to see next. And until next time, cheers.